Imagine, just for a second, that you are an archaeologist. You're digging out in the sun-baked sands of ancient Mesopotamia, right in the heart of, what we call the cradle of civilization.
Right. The Fertile Crescent.
Exactly. So you brush away the dirt, and you unearth this clay pot. And it's a beautifully functional piece of pottery, roughly 5,000 years old.
Okay.
Now imagine you pack up all your gear, you get on a plane, and you fly across the globe to the high Andes in South America.
So a completely different, totally isolated environment.
Yeah, totally cut off from the rest of the ancient world. And you dig down and you find another clay pot. And structurally, they're virtually identical.
Oh.
Right. Like they both hold water, they both have a wide, stable base, they both have a little handle for pouring. But as an archaeologist, you wouldn't actually be shocked by this.
No, you wouldn't because, the environment dictates the tool, right? Human beings need to carry water, so human beings independently invent pots.
Exactly. It's just the shared psychology of survival. Form follows function.
Right. It's totally expected.
But now, imagine you take out a magnifying glass and you look at the wet clay of both pots, right where the ancient potter pressed their hands in thousands of years ago, and you find a fingerprint.
Oh, okay.
Not just a smudge, a perfect, world, uniquely identifiable human fingerprint. You run them through a database, and the system flags a match.
Wait, a match between the two?
Yes, it is the exact same fingerprint on two pots, separated by oceans, in cultures that have absolutely no historical record of ever meeting.
Yeah, at that point, you're no longer looking at a shared idea.
Right, you are looking at a shared person. And,
Yeah.
well, welcome to today's deep dive. Because today, we are looking at a fingerprint left on human history.
And that fingerprint, frankly, it challenges everything we think we know about the ancient world.
It really does. So if you've been following our journey here, we've been unpacking this massive stack of detailed research articles by William J. Oxfield.
Yeah, the Hidden History series.
Exactly. And today is the culmination of that research. This is the brief for what he calls the series finale, which is titled One Name, Every Flood.
Which is a great title, honestly.
It is. Now, up until this point, we've spent our time basically looking at the shape of the pot, right? We've established these staggering structural parallels across completely disconnected global mythologies.
Right, the structural arguments.
Yeah. We've looked at the Aboriginal Australian traditions of the Wandjina, where you have a culture isolated for like 50,000 years, remembering divine beings that got imprisoned underground.
Which matches the Greek Tartarus and the Watchers.
Exactly. We've looked at Native American traditions across an entire continent, detailing a catastrophic flood and a hybrid giant race. We've looked at 12 different civilizations that all preserve this identical narrative sequence.
The sequence of divine beings descending, teaching forbidden knowledge, the world becoming corrupted, a global flood wiping the slate clean, and those beings being locked away.
Right. But, as we've discussed in previous deep dives, those are all structural arguments.
Yes, they are.
And the rigorous, skeptical academic mind has a very well-established framework for dismissing those structural similarities.
The psychological model.
Exactly. Most famously championed by Carl Jung.
Right. So Jung basically argued that we all share the same underlying psychological architecture, the collective unconscious.
Right, because our brains are wired the same way.
Exactly. And because we all face the same terrifying natural phenomena like floods or storms, we naturally and crucially independently invent the same stories.
So it's like the operating system comes pre-installed. You live in a river valley. You fear the river flooding. So your culture invents a myth about a world-ending flood.
Yeah, it becomes an archetype. And it's an elegant explanation. It really is.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
But today, we're moving past the structural argument. We're transitioning to linguistic and phonetic evidence.
Which is a whole different ballgame.
Totally. We're looking at hyperspecific procedural details and the exact same proper nouns preserved in complete sealed isolation. So let's unpack this, because I need to understand the boundaries here. What are the exact, scientifically accepted limits of what human psychology can just accidentally invent?
Well, to understand the limits, we really have to understand what an archetype actually is in the Jungian sense.
Okay.
The collective unconscious generates broad functional roles and narratives. It generates the concept of a hero or the concept of a trickster or, as you said, the concept of a world-ending catastrophe.
So big overarching themes.
Exactly. If an ancient isolated tribe unearths the massive fossilized femur of a woolly mammoth, Their pre-installed psychological operating system anthropomorphizes that bone.
Because they don't know what a mammoth is.
Right, they don't have paleontologists, so they create a narrative. They say, giant humans used to walk the earth.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, Jung's theory handles that beautifully. Structural parallels are kind of like building a tower out of blocks. The shape is dictated by gravity and shared human cognition.
So it doesn't require like a global conspiracy for two different kids to independently build a tower.
Exactly the opposite. It is the default outcome of having blocks and gravity.
Okay, I'm with you.
But the breakdown of the Jungian model occurs when we move from structural parallels to textual parallels.
Textual parallels, define that for me.
A textual parallel is a shared, hyperspecific detail that has zero psychological necessity.
Zero necessity, meaning the story works fine without it.
Exactly. It is a detail that does not need to exist to make the story function, yet it appears identically across disconnected traditions anyway.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, the collective unconscious might explain why two cultures invent a flood myth. It absolutely does not explain why they would independently invent the exact same bizarrely specific procedure for checking if the floodwaters have receded.
Oh man, you're talking about the bird sequence.
Yes, the bird sequence.
I was looking over Oxfield's notes on this, and it honestly reads like forensic evidence. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Walk us through the specifics of what these ancient texts actually say.
Okay, let's start with the Hebrew tradition, which, most people are pretty familiar with from Genesis chapter 8.
Right, Noah's Ark.
Yeah. So the catastrophic flood has occurred, the waters are finally beginning to recede, and the ark is resting. Now, Noah needs to know if the outside environment is safe.
Right.
But he doesn't just open the door and look.
Mm.
He initiates a very specific multi-step biological test.
Okay.
First, he opens a window and releases a raven. The text states the raven flies back and forth until the waters dry up.
So bird number one is a raven.
Next, he releases a dove. The dove finds no resting place for its feet and returns to the ark.
Right.
Noah waits 7 days, releases the dove again, and this time it returns with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak.
The famous image of the dove with the branch.
Right. And then he waits another 7 days, releases the dove a third time, and it does not return.
Okay, so the exact procedure in Genesis is raven, then dove returns with vegetation, then dove leaves permanently.
Exactly. Now, we cross over to ancient Mesopotamia, to the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Okay, going back further in time.
Yes. Specifically, we are looking at Tablet Exeath, which was famously translated by George Smith in the 19th century. And it's important to note this text physically predates the written form of Genesis by a significant margin.
Right, it's older.
In this narrative, the flood survivor is named Utnapishtim. His vessel has also run aground on a mountain. And to test the environment, he also uses birds.
Let me guess.
First, he releases a dove. The dove finds no resting place and returns. Then he releases a swallow. It finds no resting place and returns. Finally, he releases a raven. The raven flies off, finds food, wades in the receding water, and does not return.
Okay, looking at the two side by side, the order of the birds is shuffled. Genesis goes raven, then doves.
Okay.
Gilgamesh goes dove, swallow, raven.
Yes, it varies slightly.
But the underlying architecture is undeniably the same. Both survivors use a sequence of different bird species, released one by one, to test the habitability of a post-apocalyptic water world until one finally doesn't come back.
Precisely. And the question we must ask the Jungian psychologists is this: is there a universal human archetype for this? Does the human brain come pre-installed with a protocol dictating that in the event of extreme water anxiety, one must release 3 different bird species in sequence?
It's absurd on its face.
It's totally absurd.
I do want to push back on that, though, just a little. I'm trying to put myself in the mind of, like, an ancient, practical, seafaring person.
Sure.
If I'm stuck on a wooden boat and I need to find land, using birds actually makes practical sense. I mean, ancient Polynesian navigators used birds to find islands all the time.
They did, yes.
You follow the flight paths. It's an ancient technology, essentially like releasing a weather balloon to check the atmospheric conditions.
Sure.
So couldn't two different cultures just independently invent the bird weather balloon?
The practical logic of using a bird to scout for land is sound. Multiple maritime cultures could, theoretically, figure that out independently.
Okay.
But the practical utilitarian argument completely falls apart the moment you analyze the specific biology of the birds they chose and the narrative weight placed upon them.
Wait, the biology?
Yes. If you were a purely practical ancient sailor trying to survive and you wanted to find land, you would use a raven. You would only use a raven.
Why is the raven the better tool for the job?
Because corvids, ravens, and crows are scavengers. They have massive flight ranges, they are incredibly intelligent, and crucially, they are adapted to harsh environments.
Okay.
If the world has just been destroyed by a catastrophic flood, the surface of the water is going to be covered in debris, floating trees, and carrion. A raven can land on a floating carcass, feed, rest, and keep scouting. It is perfectly adapted to a post-apocalyptic environment.
Ah, I see.
A dove, on the other hand, is a columbid. It is a valley bird. It has a significantly shorter flight range, it requires dry, solid land to roost, and it requires specific, fresh vegetation to feed.
I see where this is going. If the world is a flooded wasteland, a dove is just going to starve or drown. It's a terrible weather balloon.
It is a terrible choice. From a purely practical survivalist standpoint, relying on a dove to scout a devastated world makes absolutely no sense, which tells us something vital about the text. The choice to use the dove in the story, and specifically to make the dove's return with a fresh olive branch, the grand narrative centerpiece, the ultimate symbol of hope and renewal.
Right.
That is not a choice born of practical maritime navigation. It is a highly specific theological and literary construct.
It's a symbolic choice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that precise, non-practical, symbolic construct appears in both the Hebrew and the Mesopotamian accounts. You simply do not independently invent the exact same illogical, highly symbolic procedure.
Because it goes against basic survival logic.
Right. That requires direct transmission. It requires a shared source.
Okay, so the structure is the idea of a flood, but the textual fingerprint is the bizarrely specific choice to send a valley bird to find a leaf. That makes perfect sense. Are there other examples of this kind of fingerprint in the texts?
Yes, and they occur in the very next sequence of the narrative. Immediately following the flood, after the survivor exits the vessel, both accounts feature a sacrifice to the divine.
Okay, pretty standard ancient behavior.
Sure. In Genesis 8, Noah builds an altar and offers burnt sacrifices of clean animals. The Hebrew text specifically notes that God smelled the pleasing aroma and resolved in his heart never to curse the ground or destroy all living creatures again.
Smelled the pleasing aroma.
Now, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim pours out a libation and burns a sacrifice of cane, cedar, and myrtle on the mountain peak. And the Akkadian text explicitly states that the gods smelled the sweet savor and gathered like flies around the offering.
The sensory detail is what stands out there. It's not just that they both prayed or both built an altar, it's the smell.
Exactly. Why smell? Why not sight or sound or the physical consumption of the offering?
Right, why not just eating it?
The concept that transcendent divine beings, the architects of the cosmos, are specifically attracted to and their wrath is pacified by the aroma of burning organic matter is not a universal religious archetype.
It's not.
Not at all. There are many ancient and modern religions that have absolutely no concept of their deities being swayed by the smell of smoke. It is a highly specific theological mechanism.
Right.
Yet, in both of these ancient traditions, the olfactory sense of the divine, the smell, is the exact narrative trigger that secures mercy for the surviving humanity.
Man. If independent human psychology cannot accidentally invent the sequence of the birds, and it cannot accidentally invent the divine sense of smell, how in the world can it invent the exact same proper noun for the man who built the boat?
Now we're getting to it.
Because that is the core of Oxfield's argument today. We're moving from the procedures to the names.
Yes, we are crossing the ultimate boundary. Proper nouns are the ultimate specific textual detail. The human brain does not accidentally generate the same phonetics.
So let's dive into what Oxfield calls the Noah cluster. This is the phonetic evidence that ties the global memory together.
The smoking gun.
Right. We're looking for a highly specific consonant cluster. The N sound, followed by a vowel, used across completely isolated civilizations to name the flood hero. Let's start with the origin point for many Western listeners, the Hebrew tradition.
Okay, so in biblical Hebrew, the name is pronounced Noach.
Noach.
Right. And to understand this name, we have to look at the linguistic root. It is built on the Hebrew root word nuach.
N-U-A-C-H. Nuach. What does that root actually mean in the ancient language?
It translates to rest, repose, or to settle down.
Rest. Okay.
And this meaning isn't just a linguistic trivia fact either. It is deeply embedded into the theological framework of the entire narrative.
So.
If you look back at Genesis chapter 5, Noah's father, Lamech, names his newborn son and gives a prophetic declaration. He literally says, "This one will bring us rest from our work and from the painful toil of our hands, from the ground the Lord has cursed."
Oh, wow. So the name isn't just a label, it's a literal mission statement.
Yeah.
He is the man who brings rest.
Yes, it encodes a specific theological condition. And to understand why rest was so necessary, you have to look at the broader ancient Near Eastern context, specifically texts like the Book of Enoch.
Right, which we've covered extensively.
Exactly. The pre-flood world wasn't just a place where humans were misbehaving. It was an era characterized by total cosmic chaos, violence, and genetic corruption brought about by the Watchers.
The divine beings who broke the boundary.
Right. So the flood was not just a punishment, it was a catastrophic reset mechanism to restore order. Therefore, Noah is the man who survives the chaos. He is the man of rest.
That's fascinating.
And the Hebrew text constantly plays on this root word. In Genesis 8, when the ark finally stops floating, the text uses the exact same root word, nuach, to state that the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. The waters rested, the ark rested, the survivor is named Rest.
Wow. And is that root unique to Hebrew?
It is not. The Babylonian cognate for this word is nuku, and it carries the exact same meaning of rest or pacification.
Okay, so it goes deeper.
Yes, this tells linguists that the name predates the written Hebrew text and belongs to a much older, foundational Semitic layer of language.
All right, so Noach means rest, establishing our base. Let's look at the next entry on the list, the Arabic tradition.
So in the Islamic tradition, preserved in the Quran, the name of the flood survivor is Nuh. He is recognized as one of the major prophets. He warns his people, he builds the ark, and he survives the deluge.
Now, I'm going to put on my skeptic's hat for a second here.
Please do.
Finding the name Nu in Arabic when we already have Noach in Hebrew doesn't exactly blow my mind.
Sure.
I mean, Hebrew and Arabic are sister languages in the Semitic family. They share a massive amount of vocabulary, syntax, and cultural history. It's kind of like finding out that the Spanish word for water is similar to the Italian word for water. It's expected.
Your skepticism is completely warranted, and no serious scholar would ever contest that point. Nu is a direct Semitic cognate. The presence of nu in Arabic is not the anomaly that breaks the Jungian model.
Okay, so why include it?
It is included in this cluster to establish the baseline. It proves that within a connected language family, a proper noun, specifically the name of the flood survivor, remains phonetically stable over thousands of years of oral and written transmission.
Ah, I see. Okay, baseline established. We know what it looks like when a name travels through a connected language tree. But let's look at a place that is definitely not on that tree.
Let's do it.
Let's talk about the Pacific Ocean, because there is a very famous Hawaiian mythological hero whose name fits this cluster almost too perfectly.
Yes, there is.
He survives a massive flood on a great canoe. He saves his family. He loads the canoe with animals. And after the waters go down, a deity descends on a rainbow. And his name is Nu.
N-U''A'-U.
Exactly. It is the exact same phonetic sound and the exact same highly specific narrative isolated on an archipelago in the middle of the Pacific.
The phonetic parallel is indeed striking. Noach and Nu. And the narrative details the vessel, the animal cargo, the post-flood rainbow covenant. I mean, they read like a direct translation of the book of Genesis.
Right.
But this is where rigorous intellectual honesty becomes absolutely paramount. If we want the rest of the data in this deep dive to hold up to scrutiny, we have to relentlessly interrogate our own best evidence.
So what does the historical record actually say when we interrogate the story of Nuyu?
It reveals a severe timeline contamination.
Contamination.
Yes. The Hawaiian language was entirely oral. It had no written form until Protestant Christian missionaries arrived from New England in the 1820s.
Oh.
And when you consult the definitive academic works on Hawaiian mythology, such as the research compiled by Martha Beckwith, a clear pattern emerges. The recorded story of Nuyu shows a heavy, undeniable tendency to strain after biblical analogy.
Meaning the locals were basically adapting their stories to match what the missionaries were preaching.
Exactly. When you dig into the older, pre-contact layers of Hawaiian folklore, the flood myths are much simpler and much more localized.
How so?
The traditional stories describe a great flood covering the islands, but the survivors don't build a massive canoe. Usually it's just two people who survive by climbing to the absolute summit of Mauna Kea, the highest peak.
Oh, wow.
There is no mention of loading pairs of animals. There is no theological rainbow covenant. All of those hyper-specific Genesis details, and almost certainly the phonetic name Nuyu itself, were integrated into the local mythology after sustained contact with the biblical text.
Man, it's an incredible example of how quickly oral traditions can absorb and remold new information. So The Hawaiian Nuyu is essentially an 1820s Sunday school lesson hybridized with local island folklore.
It is contaminated data. We mention it because it exists in the popular literature regarding global flood myths, but for the sake of the structural argument we are building today, we must explicitly discount it.
We throw it out.
Discarding the contaminated evidence is how we protect the integrity of the data that actually survives the filter.
That is a crucial distinction. Throw out the bad data so the real anomalies shine brighter. Okay, so we've looked at the Semitic N plus vowel cluster. Let's pivot slightly to a related phonetic anomaly that Oxfield's research highlights, the M plus N cluster. Take us to ancient India.
Right. In the ancient Sanskrit tradition, the flood hero is a figure named Manu. According to texts like the Shatapatha Brahmana, Manu is approached by a divine avatar in the form of a small fish. The fish warns him of a coming catastrophic deluge that will wipe out all living creatures.
Sound familiar?
Very. Manu cares for the fish, and in return, the fish instructs him to build a massive ship. When the flood comes, the fish, now grown to a gigantic size, tows Manu's ship to the safety of a northern mountain.
Okay.
After the waters recede, Manu performs a sacrifice, and he becomes the progenitor, the sole ancestor of all subsequent humanity.
So the narrative skeleton is a perfect match. Divine warning, construction of a vessel, survival on a mountain, post-flood sacrifice, repopulation. But the name starts with an M, not an N.
It does. And linguistically, Manu derives from a completely different etymological root than the Hebrew Noach. Remember, Noach means rest.
Right.
The name Manu derives from the Proto-Indo-European root word that literally means man or mankind.
Okay, so a different meaning.
But we have to look closely at what happens to that root word across history. Because Manu was viewed as the sole father of post-flood humanity, his descendants in the Sanskrit texts were referred to as Manavas, the children of Manu.
And Proto-Indo-European is the theoretical mother language that spawned almost all the languages of Europe and northern India, right?
Correct. It was the linguistic ancestor. And as the Proto-Indo-European language spread outward through mass migrations and evolved into different branches, that specific proper noun, the name of the sole flood survivor, became the literal biological noun for a human being in almost every language in that massive family.
Wait, his name became the word for our species?
Yes. In Old English, the root becomes the word man. In German, it becomes man.
Yeah.
It heavily influences the Slavic and Germanic language trees.
That's wild.
To show how deeply this memory penetrated, the Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 98 AD in his work Germania, recorded the origin myths of the Germanic tribes he encountered. He noted that these tribes, who were living deep in the forests of northern Europe, believed they all descended from an ancient, primordial, earth-born god or patriarch whose name was Manus.
Oh, wow. I mean, if a culture simply invents a fictional character to explain a really bad, localized rainstorm, that character's name does not typically become the definitive biological noun for the entire human species across a linguistic footprint that covers half the globe.
No, it doesn't.
But if there was a genuine remembered historical bottleneck, a single surviving patriarch from whom the entire regional population actually descended after a near-extinction event, then naming the resulting species after that specific survivor makes complete logical sense.
It is a profound functional parallel supported by an incredibly robust linguistic chain. The name of the survivor traveled physically with the human populations as they migrated across Europe and Asia.
Right.
However, a rigorous skeptic could point out that the Indo-European languages, by definition, are all connected. They share a migration route. They share a massive, sprawling cultural history.
Sure.
The mechanism of diffusion, the spread of ideas through trade, conquest, and contact can explain the Manu cluster, just as it explains the Semitic Nu baseline.
Okay, so if we really want to shadow the psychological archetype model, and if we want to completely eliminate the diffusion model, the idea that merchants just traded stories along with spices, we need to find this exact name in a place that has absolutely zero linguistic connection to the Middle East and zero geographical contact routes.
Exactly.
We need a civilization that developed in a sealed vacuum.
We need ancient China.
Let's talk about the Chinese control group. In the context of global mythology and ancient history, Oxfield positions ancient China as the ultimate testing ground. Why is that specific geography so incredibly important?
Well, in any scientific experiment, you need a control group, right? A baseline that is completely isolated from the variables you are testing.
Yeah.
In archaeology and comparative mythology, the variable we are always testing is cultural transmission. Did a wandering scribe from Babylon carry a clay tablet to another city? Did a migrating tribe bring their stories with them?
Did the story travel?
Right. The standard academic argument asserts that the flood myths and the stories of divine teachers spread outward from the ancient Near East, slowly trickling across the continents. But ancient China presents an insurmountable physical wall to that diffusion theory.
Because of the terrain.
The geography of Eurasia creates a natural quarantine. To the southwest of China, you have the Himalayas, the highest mountain range on Earth.
Pretty hard to walk across.
Exactly. To the north and west, you have the vast lethal expanses of the Gobi and Taklamakan deserts. The sheer immense distance and hostile environment prevented casual migration.
Okay.
The Silk Road, which is universally recognized as the first documented systematic trade and cultural exchange route connecting China to the West, did not formally open until approximately 130 BC during the Han Dynasty.
130 BC. That is incredibly late in the timeline of human civilization.
It is very late. Before 130 BC, there is no documented historical contact between the civilizations developing in the Yellow River Valley and the civilizations of the ancient Near East.
Wow.
No Babylonian cuneiform tablets were being traded in early Chinese imperial courts. No Hebrew prophets were wandering into the Shang dynasty. The Chinese civilization developed its foundational myths, its writing system, and its cultural identity in complete geographic and linguistic isolation during the exact same centuries that the Middle East was producing Genesis, the Sumerian epics, and the Book of Enoch.
So if the standard historical models are true, if these stories only spread through travelers sharing campfires, or if they're just random, meaningless psychological inventions, then ancient Chinese mythology should look completely fundamentally different from Middle Eastern mythology.
It should.
It shouldn't just be a little different. It should show zero crossover of highly specific textual details.
It should be a completely alien narrative landscape.
Yeah.
And yet, when we examine the earliest layers of the Chinese control group, we find the entire Watcher narrative curriculum, the exact same structural sequence of the catastrophic flood, and the N+vowel proper noun for the hero who survives it.
Let's hit the name first, because this is the core of the phonetic argument. Who is the Chinese flood survivor?
The name is Nuwa.
Nuwa.
Yes. In the oldest layers of Chinese mythological tradition, preserved in foundational texts like the Huinanzi, the cosmic order is shattered. A chaos bringer, often depicted as a water deity or a rebel, damages the pillars holding up the sky, resulting in a catastrophic world-ending flood.
Okay.
Nuwa, a creator goddess, and her brother, Fuxi, survived this global deluge. The tradition states they survived by hiding inside a massive gourd that floated on the floodwaters.
A floating vessel.
Yes. When the waters finally recede, they emerge to find they are the sole surviving conscious beings. They seek divine permission through a divination ritual to marry, and they subsequently repopulate the empty earth. In some variations of the text, Nuwa literally smelts 5 colored stones to repair the broken sky and molds the new generation of humanity out of yellow clay.
Okay, so the narrative structure is a one-to-one match with the Near East. A prior transgression breaks the world order, a catastrophic flood hits the reset button, a chosen few survive by floating in a specific vessel, and they receive a divine mandate to repopulate the earth.
Yep.
And the name, Nuwa. N-U-W-A. It carries the exact same opening consonant and vowel structure as Noach and Nu. But what about the linguistic roots? We talked about Hebrew and Arabic being related. Is there any shared root word between Chinese and the Near East?
There is absolutely none, and that is what makes this data point so astonishing. The Chinese language belongs to the Sino-Tibetan language family. It has zero etymological relation to the Semitic languages of the Middle East or the Indo-European languages of the West. It is a completely separate branch of human communication.
Right.
To understand the anomaly here, we have to look at how the Chinese writing system works. Nua's name is written using 2 distinct characters. The first character, Nu, is a common radical that simply means woman or female.
Pretty standard.
But the second character, Wa, exists nowhere else in the entire Chinese language.
Wait, what do you mean it exists nowhere else? It's not a regular word.
No. Chinese characters are often constructed by combining a radical, which gives a hint to the meaning, with a phonetic component, which gives a hint to the pronunciation. The character Wa was not adapted from an existing word for boat or water or rest.
So where did it come from?
It is a linguistic orphan. It was invented purely and exclusively to represent the name of this specific flood survivor.
That is staggering.
Think about the massive implications of that fact. In a civilization completely sealed off from the ancient Near East, operating on a completely unrelated language tree, they preserve the exact narrative sequence of the flood. They give the hero a name starting with a precise nu sound.
Yeah.
And because that sound didn't naturally exist as a name in their vocabulary, they had to invent a completely unique written character just to encode that specific phonetic memory into their language.
They literally made a new character just for her.
Yes, that is not a psychological archetype generated by a fear of rain. That is a phonetic memory, a proper noun, preserved in absolute isolation.
That is the fingerprint pressed into the clay. It's undeniable. But Oxfield's research points out that the parallels in China don't stop with the flood itself. The Chinese control group also preserves the prequel to the flood. They preserve the Watcher narrative.
They preserve the curriculum.
Okay, break that down for us.
To understand this, we need to look at the Enochic tradition, the ancient Hebrew texts, like the Book of Enoch. In those texts, the global flood doesn't just happen because humans were generally misbehaving. The flood is a response to a very specific cosmic crime.
Right, to Watchers.
Exactly. A group of divine beings, known as the Watchers, descended from the heavenly realm and unlawfully transferred a highly advanced curriculum of forbidden knowledge to primitive humanity.
Right. I have chapter 8 of the Book of Enoch pulled up here. It reads like a criminal charge sheet. It specifically names the fallen Watchers and lists exactly what disciplines they taught.
Tell me what it says.
Okay, Azazel taught metallurgy, how to forge swords, breastplates, and shields, and he taught the art of cosmetics. Barachiel taught astrology and the reading of the stars. Kazdeja taught medicine, specifically the properties of roots, plants, and the treating of illnesses.
Okay, so hold that list in your mind. Now, let us cross the Eurasian landmass back to our isolated control group in China and look at the foundational myth of their civilization. Long before the first historical dynasties, Chinese tradition speaks of an era ruled by the three sovereigns.
Three sovereigns.
These were not normal human kings. They were semi-divine beings, often depicted with extraordinary or hybrid features, who descended into human affairs from a higher realm for a specific purpose.
That was.
To teach early, primitive humanity the arts of civilization.
So we have a group of non-human intelligences descending to transfer technical knowledge. What exactly comprised the curriculum of the three sovereigns? Let's go through them.
Okay, the first sovereign was Shenong, known as the divine farmer. Tradition dictates that he taught humanity the practices of agriculture and irrigation, but more specifically, he is credited with pioneering pharmacology.
Pharmacology.
Yes. The myths say he tasted hundreds of herbs to test their medicinal value, literally mapping the medical properties of the earth's roots and plants.
There's like Kazdeja teaching the properties of roots in Enoch. Okay, who's the second?
The second sovereign was Fuxi. He is credited with creating the foundational systems of Chinese divination, the mapping of the heavens through astronomical calculation, and the invention of the first principles of writing.
Which matches Barachiel teaching astrology.
Precisely. And the third was Huangdi, the legendary Yellow Emperor. He is credited with synthesizing astronomy and medicine, but crucially, he is revered as the figure who taught humanity the arts of metallurgy and the forging of weapons for war.
Wow, let me synthesize that. We have metallurgy and weapons. We have medicine and the properties of roots. We have astronomy and the mapping of the stars. We have agriculture and writing. It is the exact same curriculum.
It is the identical list of transmitted technical arts.
Okay, but we have to be careful here, right?
Yeah.
We have to maintain absolute neutrality when we discuss these religious comparisons. We are just reporting on Oxfield's textual analysis here, not endorsing one theology over the other.
Absolutely. It is vital to note the difference in the cultural framing here. The Enochic tradition views this transfer of advanced knowledge as a catastrophic cosmic crime, a transgression that corrupted the human race and directly necessitated the cleansing judgment of the flood.
It was evil.
Yes, but the ancient Chinese tradition views this exact same transfer of knowledge approvingly, celebrating it as the glorious golden founding of their civilization.
What's fascinating here is how the historical data points align completely, even while the theological interpretations are entirely inverted. We're looking at these texts simply as historical records of a believed event. Enoch calls the teachers demons. The Chinese texts call them foundational heroes, but the architectural blueprint of what they actually did is identical.
The structural claim remains unchanged across the geographic divide. Human civilization did not develop slowly and independently through generations of trial and error. It was jump-started overnight by a specific curriculum of technical knowledge, transferred by semi-divine beings who descended from above.
Right.
Jungian psychology predicts that human cultures will naturally invent culture heroes to explain where fire or tools came from. It does not predict that two isolated cultures, separated by the Himalayas and thousands of miles of desert, will independently invent culture heroes who teach the exact same 5 highly specific technical disciplines.
It's too specific to be an accident of the human mind. And this shared memory goes even further into the physical realm, doesn't it? The Enochic texts state that this interaction between the divine realm and the human realm produced a biological anomaly, a hybrid race of giants known as the Nephilim. If China is the perfect control group, do they have a giant anomaly?
They do, and this evidence comes from the hard archaeological record, not just mythological texts.
Okay, let's hear it.
In China's Shandong province, at an excavation site called Jiaojia, archaeologists uncovered a 5,000-year-old burial ground. This site dates back to the late Neolithic era, the pre-dynastic period.
Which is when?
Which is the exact historical time frame that precedes these great ancient flood traditions. Within these graves, they found a collection of male skeletal remains that averaged approximately 6 feet 3 inches in height.
Okay, I have to admit, hearing 6'3" doesn't immediately sound like a mythical giant to a modern listener. I mean, we have professional athletes much taller than that today.
Of course. By the standards of 21st century nutrition, it is not giant. But context in archaeology is everything. We have to understand the biological mechanisms of human height.
Okay.
Height is dictated by a combination of genetics and environment, primarily caloric intake and access to high-quality proteins during childhood development. In the late Neolithic world, agriculture was still in its infancy. Diets were incredibly limited, and disease was rampant.
So people were generally much smaller.
Exactly. Because of these environmental limitations, the average height of a man in that specific region of China at that specific time was roughly 5 feet 6 inches. Furthermore, human height on a global scale did not begin to reliably increase until the massive improvements in nutrition, sanitation, and medicine over the last 2 centuries.
Ah, I see. So having a whole population of guys walking around at 6'3" in the ancient world is fundamentally different than seeing it today.
It is a staggering biological anomaly. For an entire localized population of men to average 6'3" in the Neolithic era indicates something highly unusual. It significantly exceeds any known genetic or environmental baseline for that specific time and place. They would have physically towered over every neighboring tribe.
Now, to be clear, we are not looking at these bones and saying here is absolute smoking gun proof of 30-foot biblical Nephilim.
No, absolutely not, and it must be framed carefully. Finding tall skeletons does not prove the theology of the Book of Enoch.
Right, we're just reporting the findings.
What it does do is provide hard, physical data that is perfectly consistent with the global memory. Every major ancient tradition that preserves the Watcher narrative also preserves an account of a pre-flood race of anomalous, unusual stature.
The pattern holds.
Yes. China preserves the narrative of the divine teachers, and the archaeology of China has produced physical evidence of anomalously large pre-dynastic humans in the exact right time frame. It is a physical data point that aligns flawlessly with the global textual pattern.
The pattern holds. The geography changes, the languages change, but the core memory holds.
Yeah.
Before we move on from the Chinese records, there's one more textual anomaly Oxfield brings up, and this one fast forwards out of the pre-flood era and into the 1st century AD. It's the Han Dynasty eclipse record. I need you to explain this one because the timing is unbelievable.
Yes, this is a fascinating one. During the reign of Emperor Guangwu of the later Han Dynasty, the official imperial scribes meticulously documented astronomical events. In the official historical records, they document a significant solar eclipse. Depending on the exact historical dating of Emperor Guangwu's reign, astronomical retrocalculation places this specific eclipse between the years 31 and 33 AD.
31 to 33 AD, which is the exact narrow historical window that biblical scholars and Roman historians debate for the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in Judea.
It is the exact window. Now listen to the precise language the Chinese imperial scribes used to record their reaction to this astronomical event. The official entry in the history of the Han Dynasty reads, "Yin and Yang have mistakenly switched, and the sun and moon were eclipsed. The sins of all the people are now on one man. Pardon is proclaimed to all under heaven."
Wow.
Furthermore, a separate historical entry from the exact same period reads, "Eclipse on the day of Gihai, Man from heaven died.
Mm.
And finally, the records note that 3 days after the eclipse, a highly unusual atmospheric phenomenon occurred. A halo or a rainbow encircled the sun.
The sins of all the people are now on one man. Man from heaven died. Pardon proclaimed to all under heaven. And a celestial phenomenon on the third day. It is impossible to hear that specific sequence of phrases and not immediately map it onto the core theological claims of the Christian crucifixion and resurrection narrative.
The convergence of the language and the timing is profoundly striking. However, again, as rigorous analysts of history, we must apply the necessary academic pushback.
Right, we have to report this impartially. What's the counter-argument?
In ancient Chinese tradition, the emperor was known as the Son of Heaven. He assumed a ritual, cosmic responsibility for maintaining the balance of nature. When natural disasters, famines, or terrifying omens like solar eclipses occurred, it was standard administrative practice for the emperor to ritually take the blame upon himself in order to appease the heavens and restore cosmic order.
Okay, that makes sense.
Therefore, phrases like, "the sins of the people are now on one man," can be interpreted as standard Chinese imperial boilerplate. The emperor is issuing a decree of self-blame accompanied by a general amnesty for prisoners, which was a common political move during a crisis.
That is a very solid historical counter-argument. It grounds the text in the political reality of the Han Dynasty. But, even accepting that it might be imperial boilerplate, the anomaly is still staggering. You have a Chinese emperor sitting in a palace thousands of miles away, completely cut off from the political and religious events unfolding in Roman Judea. He reacts to a solar eclipse occurring the exact same narrow window of years as the crucifixion, and he uses a combination of phrases bearing sins, a universal pardon, a man from heaven dying that echo the events in Jerusalem with terrifying precision. And then they document a sky phenomenon 3 days later.
It does not prove that the Chinese imperial court witnessed or understood the events in Jerusalem, but it is a documented historical record that demands attention. It represents a textual echo, a resonance, in a place where there should be absolute silence.
Which brings us to a massive foundational question regarding human memory. If all these cultures, from the Semitic tribes in the Middle East to the Indo-European migrations into India, to the completely isolated control group in China, if they're all remembering the exact same ancient events, the divine watchers, the transfer of forbidden knowledge, the catastrophic flood, the survivor with the N name, why are the stories slightly different?
That's the key question.
Why does China view the watchers as the glorious founders of civilization, while Enoch views them as the architects of demonic corruption? If they all witness the same truth, how does a shared event splinter into different global religions with entirely contradictory moral lessons?
Well, to answer that question, Oxfield's research introduces a concept he calls the Babel mechanism. It is the mechanism of divergence. To understand it, we have to stop looking at individual texts and start looking at how human memory operates on a macro civilizational scale over thousands of years.
The Babel mechanism. The name obviously refers to the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis, where a unified human population with a single language is scattered across the earth.
Precisely. Whether one views the Babel account as literal geographical history or as a profound theological metaphor, it describes a very real sociological and anthropological process. Human dispersal.
Right.
Imagine a single unified population that survives a profound global bottleneck event, the flood. In the immediate aftermath, they possess a shared, unified memory of the old world. They all know who the watchers were, they all know what caused the catastrophe, they all know the name of the man who built the boat.
Right, because they were just there.
But eventually, population pressures and resource scarcity force them to scatter. They migrate outward in completely different directions. Over centuries and millennia, they lose contact with one another. Their languages naturally evolve and fracture. Their environments change, requiring new survival strategies. Their social structures adapt to new terrains.
So it's the ultimate game of civilizational telephone, played over thousands of years across the Eurasian landmass.
Exactly. And as they scatter, the core structural memory, the indestructible skeleton of the foundational event, remains intact because it was a real, deeply traumatic historical occurrence. But the flesh on those bones, the cultural framing, the moral interpretations, the local names of the secondary characters, inevitably begins to diverge based on the new cultural values of the splintered groups.
I want to see this Babel mechanism in action. Can you give us a concrete example of how the exact same character gets remembered in radically different ways?
The most profound and illuminating example is found when we examine the figure of Iblis in the Islamic tradition, who's also known in pre-Islamic and various hadith traditions as Azazel.
Azazel, which linguistically is almost a perfect match for Azazel, the chief of the fallen watchers in the Hebrew Book of Enoch.
The phonetic connection is impossible to ignore. But let's examine the Islamic tradition's deep lore regarding the description of this being before his catastrophic fall. Before the creation of Adam, Iblis was not viewed as a grotesque demon. He was the most exalted, magnificent, and beautiful being in the entire heavenly realm.
Really?
Oh, yes. Islamic scholars describe him as the chief of the angels, the most knowledgeable entity, and the most devoted worshiper of God in existence. In certain mystical traditions, he is given a very specific, highly evocative title, Tash's Amalaika.
Which translates to what?
The peacock of the angels.
The peacock. That is such a vivid, specific image to assign to a spiritual being.
It is. In the symbolic vocabulary of the ancient Near East, the peacock represents the absolute apex of created beauty. It is radiant, iridescent, and visually incomparable. Iblis was the embodiment of perfection in the created order. The texts state he was made of smokeless fire, a higher element than earth.
Okay, so what happened?
His fall occurs during the creation narrative. When God creates Adam out of clay, a fundamentally lower, heavier material, God commands all the celestial beings to bow before this new human creation. Every angelic being complies, except Iblis. He refuses the command.
Why?
His reasoning is purely hierarchical. I am better than him. You created me from fire and him from clay.
It's the ultimate defining sin of pride. The arrogant assumption that the created being understands the hierarchy better than the creator.
Yes. But observe how this core narrative of the beautiful, exalted being who falls from grace splinters and evolves into breathtaking allegory. In Sufi folk traditions, there's an incredible narrative detailing how Iblis, after being cast out of the heavenly presence, manages to sneak back into the Garden of Eden to tempt Adam and Eve.
How does he do it?
The story states that he approaches the actual, literal peacock, which was stationed as the guardian of the garden's gate, recognized as the most beautiful creature inside paradise. Iblis appeals directly to the peacock's vanity. He promises the bird that if it helps him breach the garden, its magnificent beauty will become immortal and never fade.
Wow.
The peacock, swayed by the desire to preserve its own beauty, agrees. It enlists the help of the serpent, who hides Iblis in its mouth and smuggles the fallen angel past the gates.
That is incredibly poetic. So Iblis, the entity known as the peacock of the angels, uses the literal peacock's vanity to breach the perfection of the garden. Its beauty. Corrupting beauty.
It is pride exploiting pride. The instrument of humanity's corruption is the very thing that was created to be the most visually magnificent. Now let us cross-reference that deep theological metaphor of vanity and beauty with the Hebrew Book of Enoch. What is the very first specific sin attributed to the fallen watcher Azazel when he descends to earth? It isn't teaching humans how to forge swords for war. That comes later.
Oh wait, it's cosmetics.
Yes. Enoch chapter 8 explicitly states that Azazel taught humans how to make their eyes alluring with antimony, a dark metallic element used as ancient eyeliner, and how to use precious stones and coloring tinctures. He taught the beautifying arts, the enhancement of physical appearance.
That's crazy.
It is the vanity of the created order turned against its original purpose. In the Hebrew Enochic tradition, the fallen being corrupts humanity through the introduction of cosmetics and physical vanity. In the Islamic Sufi tradition, the fallen being, whose name is Azazel, the peacock corrupts humanity through the vanity of the peacock.
They're singing the exact same historical song, they're just playing it in different theological genres. The mechanism of corruption is vanity in both. But you mentioned a third split in this geography, a group that looks at this exact same event, the refusal to bow, and flips the moral framework completely upside down.
Yes, the Yazidis. They are an ancient, distinct ethno-religious group located primarily in northern Iraq. Their religion is incredibly old, predating and overlapping with both ancient Zoroastrianism and early Islam, and the supreme figure in their theology is the peacock angel, known in their language as Tawsi Melik.
The peacock angel again. The imagery is locked in.
The Yazidi tradition remembers the exact same precipitating cosmic event. God commands the peacock angel to bow to the newly created human, Adam, and the peacock angel outright refuses. But the Yazidi interpretation of why he refused is an entirely different theological paradigm.
Okay, what's their take?
According to their core theology, God had previously issued a command to Taosi Melech, ordering him to never bow to any being other than the supreme God himself. Therefore, when God later creates Adam and issues the command to bow, the peacock angel refuses because he is strictly, unwaveringly adhering to the first command.
Oh, wow. So they view the command to bow to Adam not as a genuine order, but as a test of loyalty. And by refusing to bow, the peacock angel passed the test.
Exactly. What the Islamic tradition condemns as the ultimate unforgivable sin of pride, the Yazidi tradition honors as the supreme act of theological faithfulness and unwavering loyalty to the Creator. Because he passed the test, God places Taosi Melech in charge of the world.
That's the Babel mechanism perfectly realized. And what's fascinating here is that this massive divergence in the moral lesson is actually the strongest proof possible that these cultures are remembering a real historical event rather than just copying a text.
Right, because if you copy the text, you copy the moral.
Exactly. If the Yazidis or the early Muslims were just physically plagiarizing a scroll from the Hebrews, they would have copied the moral lesson too. You don't copy a story about the ultimate villain and accidentally make him your supreme worshipped hero.
That is the absolute crux of the argument. Divergence in the moral interpretation proves it was a shared memory of an event, not a copied manuscript. If they copied a text, they share the moral. But because they witnessed or remembered an event, they formed entirely different cultural opinions on what that event actually meant.
It's like witnesses to a car crash.
Or a complex political revolution today. 10 different people can watch the exact same leader overthrow a government, and they will walk away with 10 entirely different interpretations of whether that leader was a heroic liberator or a demonic tyrant. The Babel mechanism predicts exactly this outcome. The structural preservation of the core event, the refusal to bow, the specific peacock imagery, the name Azazel, combined with radically divergent theological interpretations of motives.
And this Babel scattering, this fragmentation of civilizational memory, it didn't just stay localized in the Middle East. It didn't just travel along the Silk Road to our control group in China. It reached the ultimate, undeniable control group, the one place on Earth that absolutely no serious senator can argue had contact with the ancient Near East during its formative millennia.
The Americas. The isolation of the pre-Columbian Americas is the anvil upon which the entire cultural diffusion theory shatters. The Bering Land Bridge submerged thousands of years before the invention of writing. There was no Silk Road across the Atlantic or the Pacific in the ancient era. There are no Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets buried in the Andes. The populations of the Americas developed in total hemispheric isolation.
Yet the memory survived the crossing. You look at the Maya, specifically the texts preserved by the Quiche Maya and the Popol Vuh. They vividly remember previous ages of creation that were populated by the Quenemetsen.
Right.
These were arrogant, giant beings of partial divine origin who failed to honor the creator gods and were subsequently destroyed by a catastrophic flood. It is the Nephilim narrative, beat for beat, preserved in the jungles of Central America.
It is the Enochic sequence in full. The emergence of giant hybrid beings, the introduction of arrogance and corruption, the divine deployment of a flood as an instrument of judgment, the total destruction of the corrupted race, and the subsequent new creation of modern humanity.
And the hyperspecific textual details made it across the ice bridge, too. The Catawba tribe, an indigenous people in North America, have a flood tradition recorded long before any meaningful European contact could have contaminated their mythology. In their tradition, a flood survivor is floating in a vessel, waiting for the waters to recede. How does he check if the earth is dry?
He waits for a dove to return with a leaf in its beak.
The exact same highly specific, non-practical procedural detail from Genesis 8, preserved by an indigenous tribe in the Carolinas.
It's astounding.
And then you look at the Lakota. The Lakota tradition speaks of a great, purifying flood that destroyed the corrupted previous world. And when the waters finally withdrew, the Creator gave humanity a profound visual sign, a permanent covenant that the earth would never again be destroyed by water. The sign was a rainbow.
Genesis chapter 9, verse 13, manifesting independently in the Great Plains of North America, an isolated continent, the exact same post-flood theological covenant sign, the exact same specific textual details surviving the greatest geographical dispersal in human history.
Which brings us to the climax of this entire deep dive, the argumentative peak of Oxfield's series finale. We have laid out the global structural parallels, the archaeological giant anomalies, the hyperspecific linguistic clusters, and the undeniable isolation of the control groups. I want you to synthesize this. Deliver the final blow to the shared psychology argument. Why does Carl Jung's theory of the collective unconscious ultimately fail?
We can state the central thesis of this entire research project very simply. The collective unconscious, the shared inherited psychological architecture of the human brain, generates archetypes. It does not generate proper nouns.
It's like this. Human psychology, driven by the basic physical need to move heavy things across distances, might dictate that multiple completely isolated inventors in different parts of the world will independently come up with the concept of a wheel.
Right.
That is a structural outcome dictated by reality.
Yeah.
But human psychology absolutely does not dictate that 5 isolated inventors will all independently decide to name their wheel Firestone.
That analogy perfectly encapsulates the failure of the psychological model. Archetypes do not have names. Historical memories do. When isolated civilizations, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, independently generate the broad, functional narrative role of a righteous flood survivor who repopulates the Earth, you can successfully argue that is psychological. You can argue it is the universal archetype of destruction, chaos, and renewal.
Sure.
But when they all give that specific survivor a name, starting with the N consonant and a vowel, Noach, Nu, Nuwa, Nuu, and when they surround him with the exact same non-practical sequence of birds, the exact same smelling sacrifices, and the exact same pre-flood giant biological anomalies, that is no longer an archetype. That is a remembered person.
But psychological models simply cannot absorb that level of phonetic and procedural specificity. It chokes on the details.
It cannot process it. Carl Jung was brilliant in observing the incredible, undeniable shared patterns across human mythology. He saw the structural similarities clearly, but instead of drawing the logical conclusion that these scattered cultures were remembering a real shared historical epoch, he concluded that the human brain was just a biological factory programmed to produce the exact same imaginary symbols.
Right.
He observed the perfect fingerprints pressed into the clay, and he concluded that the fingers never actually existed. But the specificity of the evidence we've discussed today, the N and the vowel, the unique Chinese character Wa, the dove and the leaf, the specific curriculum of forbidden knowledge demands a radically different conclusion.
So what does this all mean for us? We've taken the listener on a massive, sprawling journey today. From the clay tablets of Gilgamesh to the linguistic roots of Sanskrit, to the invention of a unique Chinese character, to the peacock angel of northern Iraq, to the rainbow of the Lakota tribe. If your head is spinning from tracing all these connections, let's ground this. What is the grand takeaway from Oxfield's research?
The grand takeaway is a fundamental paradigm shift in how we must view ancient texts. The mythological stories of the world are the same, not because all humans think the same thoughts. They are the same because all humans once knew the exact same events.
Wow.
The mythological traditions of the world are not collective fiction. They are shattered, fragmented history. The Australian Aboriginal Wandjina beings who descended from the sky are said to be locked underground. The Greek Titans who rebelled are locked in the darkness of Tartarus. The Enochic Watchers are bound in the deep abyss.
It's all the same prison.
The prison sentence is the exact same. Noach rested, Nuao repaired the sky, Manu survived in the boat. The man is the same. The event is real.
The Watcher narrative is the skeleton. The name cluster is the fingerprint. And that realization is exactly where the academic research ends and where the fiction begins. Because this entire deep dive has been an exploration of the historical textual foundation for William J. Oxfield's upcoming novel, The Vanderbilt Deception, which is targeted for release in June 2026.
That's right.
The book takes all of this incredibly real data, the Noah cluster, the Tartarus imprisonment, the Georgia giant anomalies, and asks a terrifying modern question. What happens when someone in the present day starts pulling on these exact historical threads? If this wasn't just a myth, what do they find waiting for them?
The research we discussed today is entirely real. The ancient texts exist, the linguistic connections and the phonetic anomalies exist. The fiction begins exactly where the research ends, exploring the modern implications of uncovering this ancient, forgotten reality.
And as we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It's the thread that connects the ancient mythological past to our immediate future. If every isolated civilization on Earth, from the Greeks to the Aboriginal Australians, from the Maya to the Norse, vividly remembered the exact same ancient event where these highly advanced divine rebel beings were imprisoned beneath the earth, what exactly did their ancestors remember about the duration of that sentence?
Because in every legal system and in every ancient cosmology, every prison sentence eventually ends.
We started today looking at a fingerprint pressed into ancient clay. The question now is, whose hand is reaching out of the dirt? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking closer at the myths you thought you knew, and we will see you next time.